In the winter of 1893, a municipal excavation worker named Theodore Voss descended into a trench beneath the cobblestones of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that city engineers had ordered sealed for 31 years. He carried a kerosene lantern, a surveyor's notebook, and a brass compass that had belonged to his father. The walls of the trench were not earthen. They were smooth, not plastered, smooth, the way riverstone smooths after centuries of current. And they were not the walls of any trench. They were the walls of a tunnel that predated every map the city of Milwaukee had ever produced. Voss measured the diameter at 11 feet, 4 inches. He followed the tunnel north for 220 yards before his lantern revealed something that made him stop walking entirely. A junction. 6 tunnels meeting at a single chamber. Cast iron fittings at every junction. Fittings that were not corroded. Fittings that were, by any technical measure, still functional. By the time Voss climbed out of that trench, he had 3 pages of detailed measurements, a rubbing of an embossed marking on the largest fitting, and a question that would consume the remaining 19 years of his life. When he finally published his findings in 1896, the first thing he wrote was that the pipe system beneath Milwaukee had not been built by Milwaukee. The second thing he wrote was that it had not been built in this century. The official city record for that 1893 excavation states that workers encountered a section of pre-existing storm drainage from the 1840s, determined it to be structurally obsolete, and sealed it with concrete fill. What the official record does not mention is Theodore Voss. It does not mention the junction chamber. It does not mention the embossed marking, which Voss had submitted to the Smithsonian Bureau of American Ethnology in October of 1896, along with a written account of his findings. Voss was not an eccentric. He was not a man given to speculation or fantasy. He had been a licensed surveyor for the city of Milwaukee for 11 years. He had certified the structural plans for the Pfister Hotel. He had signed off on the drainage grid beneath the 3rd Ward. His professional reputation was, until 1896, considered beyond question. Within 4 months of his Smithsonian submission, the Bureau returned his documentation without comment. Within 6 months, Voss was removed from his position with the city. The stated reason was a budget reorganization. His name does not appear in any subsequent city employment records. In 1912, he died in a boarding house in Racine, Wisconsin. He was 59 years old. He had not been ill. His landlady told a local reporter that he had seemed, in his final weeks, like a man who had finished something important. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Voss found beneath Milwaukee, we have to go back, not just a few decades. We have to go back to a world that the official history of American cities has quietly and systematically dismantled. The period between 1840 and 1880 in North American urban development is presented in mainstream historical accounts as a story of construction, of cities being built upward and outward from raw prairie and marshland. What that account does not address is what was already there when the builders arrived. The official story of municipal water and sewage infrastructure in the United States begins, depending on the city, somewhere between 1840 and 1870. New York's Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, is typically held up as the beginning of modern American water infrastructure. Philadelphia's Fairmount Waterworks is presented as the pioneer. Boston, Chicago, and St. Louis are described as having built their systems from nothing, street by street, at enormous public expense and over decades of labor. The historical record presents this construction as a great civic achievement, and in many ways it was. But it also presents a specific and convenient fiction that before these systems were built, there was nothing. Raw ground. Empty earth. Cities dropped onto untouched soil. The anomalies in that account have been documented by independent researchers, municipal historians, and, most importantly, by the workers who were hired to build the new systems and found themselves not building, but uncovering. Their accounts are scattered across newspaper archives, private correspondence, and in some cases, official documents that were quietly reclassified or removed from public access in the years following their submission. Frederick Olmsted, the landscape architect best known for Central Park, made note in an 1858 letter to his brother John that surveyors working beneath what would become the park had encountered stonework of a depth and regularity that puzzled every engineer on site. He described the stonework as resembling the lower courses of a Roman aqueduct, though he offered no theory as to its origin. The letter was included in a published collection of Olmsted's correspondence in 1924 and has not been republished since. What Olmsted described in New York in 1858 was not the first such account, and it was not the last. In 1847, before the first shovel of earth was turned for Philadelphia's modern sewer expansion, a contractor named Samuel Elias Brandt submitted a written notice to the Philadelphia Department of Surveys, advising that his crew, while preparing ground on Chestnut Street, had broken through the cap of what appeared to be an existing subterranean channel running roughly east to west beneath the street at a depth of 14 feet. Brandt's notice described the channel as lined with a fired material he could not identify, laid without mortar, and fitted at intervals with iron collars, whose threading pattern matched no standard used in Philadelphia at that time. He asked the Department of Surveys for guidance. The department's written response, which survives in the city's historical records, instructed Brandt to cap the opening, continue with the scheduled excavation above it, and not to include any mention of the prior channel in his submitted field notes. Brandt complied. But he kept a personal copy of his original notice. That copy was passed down through his family, and in 1968, his great-granddaughter deposited it with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where it remains catalogued under a miscellaneous contractor correspondence accession, uncited in any published history of Philadelphia's infrastructure. A German-trained civil engineer named Wilhelm Brauer, who oversaw drainage construction in St. Louis from 1867 to 1874, filed a formal report with the St. Louis Board of Public Improvements in March of 1871, detailing the discovery of what he described as a continuous subterranean conduit running beneath Market Street at a depth of 18 feet. Brauer's report included hand-drawn cross-sectional diagrams of the conduit's interior. He noted that the material used in the conduit's construction was unlike any fired brick or cast component in current municipal use. It had a density and smoothness that his professional training could not account for. The report was received, logged, and acknowledged by the board. It does not appear in any subsequent city archive. The board's index from 1871 lists a submission from Brauer in March of that year, with the notation withdrawn by author. Brauer never withdrew it. His son, Hugo Brauer, a lawyer in St. Louis until his death in 1931, spent decades attempting to locate the original submission and was told repeatedly that it had been misfiled. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the official history of North American cities, particularly the period between 1840 and 1890, is missing entire chapters that mainstream historians refuse to engage with. Buildings appear in photographic records that no construction permits claim were ever built. Infrastructure appears in excavation reports that no city plan acknowledges having designed. The pipe system Theodore Voss found beneath Milwaukee was not unique. It was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern that stretches across every major city on this continent, and the response to that pattern, from institutions, from city governments, from federal agencies, has been, in each case, the same. Philadelphia, 1847, a contractor breaks through an unrecorded subterranean channel on Chestnut Street and is instructed in writing to omit it from his field notes. St. Louis, 1871, a licensed civil engineer files a formal report detailing a continuous conduit beneath Market Street and watches his submission disappear from the archive within 2 years. Milwaukee, 1893, a city surveyor descends into a trench, finds a 6-tunnel junction chamber with functional iron fittings, and loses his job within 6 months of reporting it. Cincinnati, 1884, a crew laying water mains on 5th Street encountered what the foreman's daily log describes as a brick-lined passage of approximately 8 feet in diameter running perpendicular to the planned pipe route. The log entry ends mid-sentence. The following day's entry continues as if the passage was never mentioned. The foreman, a man named Caspar Holtz, filed no formal report. He did, however, write to his brother in Germany 3 weeks later, and that letter, located in a private family archive in Düsseldorf and translated into English by a researcher in 2011, describes the passage in detail, including the presence of a bracket system along the interior wall designed, in Holtz's professional judgment, to support a pipe of considerably larger diameter than the passage itself, as if the builder had planned for something that was never installed, or had been removed. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. Voss was the first to document the junction chamber beneath Milwaukee, but he was not the last person to enter it. In 1907, 14 years after the original excavation, a plumber named James Okafor was called to investigate a section of the Milwaukee sewer grid that had begun producing anomalous pressure readings. Okafor was a 17-year veteran of the city's waterworks. He had never heard of Theodore Voss. He had never read the 1896 Smithsonian submission. He descended into the same section of the grid through a maintenance access point that had been installed following the 1893 excavation and found himself, after 20 minutes of crawling through modern pipe, standing in a chamber he had no way to account for. He described it in a handwritten report to his supervisor as approximately 40 feet in diameter, with 6 tunnel openings at equal intervals around its circumference, and fittings at each opening that appeared to him to be, in his words, factory-made, but not from any factory he recognized. His supervisor's written response to the report, which survives in the Milwaukee Public Library's Municipal Archive, reads in its entirety, noted, "Do not re-enter. Grid is to be rerouted above this level." Okafor's report is the only document in the Milwaukee Archive that directly references the chamber beneath the Third Ward. Every other document produced before, during, or after the 1893 excavation either does not mention it or explicitly states that the pre-existing infrastructure was structurally obsolete. The documentary thread on this case runs through 3 separate institutions. First, the Smithsonian Bureau of American Ethnology, which received Voss's 1896 submission and returned it without comment. Second, the Milwaukee Board of Public Works, whose index lists Voss's name in connection with a 1893 excavation report, but whose physical archive contains no such report. Third, the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division, which holds a set of infrastructure survey maps for Milwaukee dated 1889, 4 years before Voss descended into that trench, that show a grid of subterranean passages beneath the Third Ward in a hand different from every other notation on the same map. Those passages are labeled in the same unfamiliar hand, pre-existing system, origin unknown. Pre-existing. Those are the mapmaker's words, not the words of Voss, not the words of Okafor. The mapmakers in 1889 already knew. But here is what makes this case different from every other account of suppressed municipal infrastructure. In 1931, a retired city engineer named Arthur Messing gave an interview to a Milwaukee journalist named Clara Holt, who was writing a series on the history of the city's waterworks. Messing had worked for the city from 1901 to 1929. He had never spoken publicly about what he knew. He was 73 years old and had been told by the journalist that the interview would run in the city's centennial supplement. It never ran, but Holt's original transcript of the interview survives in a private collection that was partially digitized by the Wisconsin Historical Society in 2018. In that transcript, Messing tells Holt that the decision to reroute the modern sewer grid above the pre-existing system in 1907, the decision documented in the response to Okafor's report, was not made by the city engineer's office. It was made, Messing says, at a meeting he attended personally, by a representative of a private company whose name he gives as the Continental Infrastructure Corporation. Messing says the representative arrived with documentation showing that the Continental Infrastructure Corporation held a prior claim to the pre-existing system. Not a municipal claim, a prior claim, a property claim. The city's own engineer, Messing says, asked who had built the system, and the representative's answer was that the question was not relevant to the meeting. The Continental Infrastructure Corporation. That name does not appear in any publicly available corporate registry before 1902. It does not appear in the Milwaukee city government records. It does not appear in any newspaper archive until 1911, when it is mentioned once, briefly, in a Chicago Tribune article about a real estate transfer in St. Louis, the same stretch of Market Street where Wilhelm Brauer had filed his 1871 conduit report. The transfer involved a parcel of land that, according to county survey records, contained no improvements above ground, no building, no structure. The stated purchase price was $46,000. In 1911, that sum would purchase a substantial commercial property in downtown St. Louis. The parcel being transferred was a vacant lot. What was being purchased, what justified that price, was not stated in any public record. Arthur Messing believed he knew. He told Clara Holt, in the transcript she kept, that the Continental Infrastructure Corporation was not building anything beneath these cities. It was protecting something that was already built. He said that in 30 years of working for the city of Milwaukee, every time a crew encountered the lower system, the response was not investigation. It was containment. Get above it. Root around it. File nothing. He said he did not know who had built the lower system, and he did not think the people who showed up at those meetings knew either. What they knew was that it existed, and that knowing it existed was enough of a reason for them to keep everyone else from knowing. The Board of Public Works has never adequately addressed several specific questions. It has never explained why the 1893 excavation report filed by Theodore Voss does not appear in its physical archive, despite appearing in its index. It has never explained why the 1889 survey map in the Library of Congress shows infrastructure labeled Origin, unknown in a section of Milwaukee that the city's official history describes as undeveloped marshland. It has never explained why a private corporation was present at a municipal engineering meeting in 1907, or what prior claim that corporation held to infrastructure beneath a public street. Why did the city reroute a modern grid above a pre-existing system rather than simply documenting and integrating it? Why does the index contain Voss's name, but the archive contain no document? Why would a corporation travel to Milwaukee to present a prior claim to underground infrastructure unless the infrastructure was worth claiming? Why would infrastructure be worth claiming if its origin was unknown? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. What we have are survey maps, archived indices, a surviving interview transcript, and a pattern of institutional responses that is consistent across 6 cities on this continent, and a pattern of suppression that, even if it does not prove the underlying claim, is itself worth investigating. For the next 11 years after his removal from city employment, Theodore Voss attempted to return to the Junction Chamber. He filed 4 formal requests with the Milwaukee Board of Public Works for access to the 1893 excavation site. Each was denied. In 1903, he hired a lawyer to file a public records request for his own 1893 excavation report. The city's response stated that no such report existed. In 1907, the same year that James Okafor filed his independent account of the chamber, Voss wrote a letter to the editor of the Milwaukee Sentinel that the paper did not publish. The letter, which his grandson found among Voss's papers in 1947 and donated to the Milwaukee Public Library, contains a sentence that has stayed with everyone who has read it. Voss writes, "I do not ask anyone to believe what I found. I ask only that someone explain what the 1889 map acknowledges, but the 1893 record denies. The junction chamber beneath Milwaukee's 3rd Ward still exists. The modern sewer grid runs above it at a depth of 9 feet. The pre-existing system, documented in 1893, noted on an 1889 survey map, confirmed independently in 1907, lies below that at a depth of approximately 18 to 22 feet. If you walk above the 3rd Ward today, on the cobblestone stretch between North Water Street and Broadway, you are walking above infrastructure whose origin the city of Milwaukee's own maps described as unknown 137 years ago. If you ask the city's Department of Public Works about the pre-existing system, they will tell you it was obsolete 19th century drainage, sealed and rendered inactive generations ago. Theodore Voss measured the fittings at the junction points. He described them as functional. James Okafor, 14 years later, and without any knowledge of Voss's account, described the same fittings as appearing to be factory-made and operational. And somewhere below the modern grid, below the rerouted pipes and the concrete fill and the layers of institutional denial, the 6-tunnel junction that 2 men documented independently still sits, and the embossed marking that Theodore Voss pressed into paper and mailed to the Smithsonian in October of 1896, the marking that the Bureau returned without comment, has never been identified. No foundry, no manufacturer, no patent record, no country of origin. The official history of municipal infrastructure in North America tells us that modern cities were built from scratch, on empty ground, by documented laborers with documented materials according to documented plans. What the survey maps tell us, what the excavation reports tell us, what the independent accounts of workers in 6 separate cities across 4 decades tell us, is that the ground was not empty. The systems were already there, and every institution that encountered evidence of those systems made the same decision: not to study them, not to document them, to root around them and say nothing. History does not disappear because it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. If you've made it this far, you already know that buried records don't stay buried forever. Someone always finds the index. Someone always keeps the transcript. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Next week, I'm pulling a thread that connects the infrastructure beneath Milwaukee to a set of architectural survey photographs taken in Chicago in 1871 the year before the Great Fire. There is a building in 3 of those photographs that does not appear on any permit record, any deed, or any insurance map before or after the fire. It appears in the photographs. Then it doesn't appear anywhere else. A city surveyor named Thomas Reed filed a note about it in November of 1871. You won't want to miss it.